Hello everyone and welcome to the first video of the Global Astronomy week or month in this case, and I'm hosting a live about cosmogonies, the birth of the universe in mythology. We'll see how mythology is a big part of who we are, but I don't want to start when there's no one still there, so I'm gonna wait a couple of minutes so that more people can arrive. In the meantime, I'll be checking some audio levels, so stay tuned. So let's see. For all of you who are watching now or who are watching in a later day of this week, I'm sorry, I just missed a word there. We are going to talk about this in English for the English public, for the international public, but we are going to make this public for everyone in Italian. So if you are someone from an Italian public, don't worry, you aren't going to be missing anything. Having said this, we are going to talk about cosmogonies for half an hour, and then the other half an hour I'm going to be listening to your questions and trying to answer what you are answering. Okay, so let me see if anyone is there. Okay. Hello, welcome. So we are six. Now, I'm going to be getting started here because this live event is going to be relatively short. It's only going to be 1 hour. And as I said, it's going to be half an hour of me talking about cosmogonies, and then the other half will be dedicated to your questions. Now, we are going to start from the present day. When we talk about the origin of the universe, when we talk about cosmogonies, we have in mind the idea of a gigantic universe. So when we talk about universe, when I say universe, what do you think? You think about galaxies, stars, billions of galaxy clusters and black holes and interstellar travel. But in reality, our idea of a universe has changed a lot in our history. For example, if you were to go to late 800s and the start of the last century, well, the universe in that age was our galaxy. Everyone used to think that everything that exists is just in the Milky Way. Every star, every nebulae, every planet, all there is just the Milky Way. Of course, you could say, but it's easy to see other galaxies. We could see, for example, the Andromeda galaxy. Yes, but at that time, we weren't sure about the distances. We knew about galaxies, but we used to call them spiral nebulae. So we used to think that they were parts of our galaxy. Of course, then we understood that galaxies are very big, and that those little galaxies, those spiral galaxies that we used to see between stars, are millions or hundreds of millions of light years away from us. Prior to this, if we go to the late 600s, we used to think that everything in the universe was the sun, the planets, and the stars surrounding our solar system. So the universe was just the sun and the planets. And all the stars we are used to seeing in the sky were, and of course the Milky Way, were in some ways surrounding this perfect circular system. Of course, now we know that's not the case, and we know that our star is just one of billions in our Milky Way. But at that time, we didn't have ways in which we could verify the distance to other stars. So we kind of thought that all the stars we see are just 7,000 stars surrounding our solar system. Of course, then we started being able to, with telescopes, measure the distance to other stars, and suddenly the universe became huge. But before the idea of a solar system as the universe, we had the idea as the Earth, as the universe. Everything that really existed was the Earth, and then there were other entities that surrounded the Earth. This was the idea that we had for most of our history. Since the age of ancient civilizations till the age of Renaissance and the modern age, we had the idea that everything is centered around the Earth. This is important because we weren't stupid. Remember that if you go to 10,000 years ago, well, the humans that lived 10,000 years ago were exactly humans like us. They just lacked the knowledge and they lacked all the instruments to manage to make discoveries like we do. But they weren't stupid. So when they try to give an explanation about how the universe works, how the universe is made, how big is it, they manage to do so in a satisfying way for their needs. Now, when we talk about myths, we usually think about mythology as fairy tales. And in a way, it kind of makes sense. I mean, they're talking about mythical creatures and gods and conflicts between gods and Thor and Zeus and mythological creatures with like dragons. But in reality, those were symbols. Remember, when you are trying to give an explanation about everything, you have to come to terms with not managing to explain everything. In modern terminology, so we are used to modern scientific terms. We are used to talking about photons, we are used to talk about atoms, matter, energy, and galaxies. But when you don't have these terms, this comprehension about the universe, you still have to invent narratives and terms to explain what you see around you. Myths were born to explain, to give an idea of how things work and how everything is organized. Now, the beautiful thing about cosmogonies is that it's not just about a myth about how everything was born. It's a myth that has a function. Because imagine being one of these people. Imagine being someone who lived 20,000 years ago. You didn't have any comprehension about how the universe is made. You didn't have any comprehensions about anything. But you did have the intelligence and the capacity of analyzing things like we do. So you look around you, and what do you see? You see geological features like mountains and hills and seas. You see the morphology of the geological features. So you could see a valley, you could see some very steep mountain or some very shallow valleys, and you kind of feel like this is an environment in which you can live. So you start building things, and then a hurricane comes and destroys everything. Now, when the hurricane destroys everything you built, you have to kind of come to terms with the fact that hurricanes come and go and destroy everything you build. You don't know what they are. You can't reason with them, you can't explain them, and you need some way to make sense of their coming and going and destroying everything. And then comes out a volcano, and then it rains, and then it doesn't rain, and all your crops fail, and then you see the stars coming and going and changing, and then you see eclipses, and all these things come and go cyclically, and you kind of notice that, for example, rain and freezing cold and very hot summers are related to what happens in the sky. So when certain stars are in the heavens, you have very, very cold nights and very long nights. When other stars are in the heavens, you have long days and very warm days. So you start to ask yourself if these things are related. So if the universe, as you see it around you, has a relationship, deep relationship with what happens to you. And of course, you are a conscious being and you think socially, and you have the perception, the empathic perception of socially relating to another person. We are very empathic. We tend to create relations with everything around us. So, for example, if you ever had a doll or an object with which you have a certain relationship, or I don't know, for example, your car or your house or an object, is simply something that you grew with, and you kind of give it a name and you see it as having a life and a will of its own. Of course, your car doesn't have a will of its own, but maybe you give it a name and you talk to it like it was a person. And the reason we do this, for example, with dolls, it comes very easy because they look like humans, or for example, with domestic animals like cats and dogs. Well, it's because we tend to create empathic relationships with other things around us. So when we create these empathic relationships, we empower these objects with our desires, with our fears, with our idea of a being. So like a car could stop just because it's angry with you, and if we talk to it, it's gonna restart. These things may make us laugh, but in origin, these are the reason we gave birth to myths. We have an empathic relation to everything around us. So when you make a crop and then a hurricane arrives and destroys everything around you, you kind of relate to that hurricane and you really, really, really hate it. And you kind of do the same thing with everything around you. So this is the first level of creating something. It's our way of relating to everything in our reality. Now, when we gave birth to the cosmogonies, when we gave birth to everything we know and think about the universe, we created narratives about what we felt about that world. We created narratives that reflected our way of being in the world. So when we talked about astronomy, about how the heavens are made and how the world was made, we reflected our ideas of how we are, how we relate to each other. And it's not a case that if we look at the myths about the birth of the universe, we see a narrative of wars, of destruction, of change, and divisions. And we see this over and over again in every myth. And it's not the case that everything in the cosmogony's myths has a certain way of being that reflects our way of being. So we have evil gods and we have good gods. So we have mothers and fathers and sons and daughters and conflicts, and everything is reflected as we are socializing in the world. And it's beautiful if you think about it, because this thing never changed. Our way of thinking about the universe today reflects our way of thinking about us today. Of course, this is a game of a ball in which all we give to this image of the universe comes back to us, and we change in reflection. But coming back to our cosmogonies, when we look at the stories in every place of the world, what we notice about the myths and how the universe gave birth to the world, to the skies, to the stars, to the sun, to the moon, tells us something very important on what we felt about us being in the world. One thing we can notice everywhere is that prior to the birth of humankind, which usually comes from conflict, we can see that the world was static or perfect. So we either have a Garden of Eden kind of start, or we have a nothing kind of start. So we can create some patterns that we see in cosmogonies all over the world. For example, some things that we see, let me find something. Okay, so we have cosmogonies that start with nothing, ex nihilo. These cosmogonies are, for example, like sort of like the Bible, cosmogonies in which there was nothing and then something created everything from that. Then we have creation from chaos. These cosmogonies start with a realm with emptiness and shallow seas of sort. And usually it's something that gave light. Now, light is very important in every myth, even if we're talking, for example, of Maori myths and the Bible myth and Sumerian myths and ancient Egypt myths or Greek myths, we find light as birth of everything. So light is one of these elements that, of course, if you think about it, is very important because we are diurnal animals. So we tend to relate to light. It's the same with the sun. We usually think about the sun as the most important thing we can have around us in our universe. And the sun is of course, very important. And in myths, the sun is usually the most powerful being, but not always by itself. But coming back to us, we have another myth in which we have world parenthood. For example, there are a lot of myths like the Maori in New Zealand and South Australia, and the Maori myth starts with a parenthood in which a mother and a father are entangled, and the birth of the world is their separation. Then we have the emergence. The emergence is usually from seas, and usually we have the egg as a symbol in these cases. Then we have one of my favorites. It's the Earth Diver myth. So we have all these legends in various parts of the world where the world was born because a huge creature, a mythological creature, transcended the heavens and plunged into the abyss of the seas, and then took some bits of the floor of the sea, and when it came out, it let these pieces all over the world, and it gave birth to isles and continents and the world as we know it. And this earth diving creature is a pattern that we see, for example, in Finno-Hungarian culture, so Hungary and Finland, which have a common source in north of Asia and the region between Siberia and the Volga. And the interesting thing is that we see this pattern in the north of Siberia, and then we see it in Native American myths. And it makes sense because where did Native Americans come from? Native Americans come from the migration of humans through Siberia, through the Bering Sea, to Canada, and then to all over the Americas. And when they passed along in their migration, of course, they took along the myths. So it's not a case if we see this earth diving creature as a myth of creation in Finland, in Hungary, in Siberia, and in Native American cultures. It tends to vary because if there's something we're extremely good at, it's creating new versions of things. You could say that many of the technologies we've invented is a version of something already existent, made better and newer. So we tend to do that with cultures too. We tend to take myths and recreate them and of course, like we said at the start, in the image of our relationship with the world, with things, with other people, with other persons. Now, I'm going to talk a little about some of the biggest myths out there. I'm not going to talk about all of them because, God, there are a lot. So there are thousands of myths. And the beautiful thing is that we know of only a fraction of the myths that are out there. Every year, anthropologists go all over the world and find out about thousands of new myths. And it's something that is being lost as time goes on, because of course in many tribes there's no one to listen to these myths. So we're never going to find out everything humanity has imagined. So everything we know about is just a little fraction about how we imagine the world. But I'm going to talk about some of the biggest, most famous myths. Not all of them, because I want to talk about some of the myths that are not so famous. For example, I'm going to start with the Maori myths, because they are extremely beautiful. So the Maori myths talks about two parents, a mother and a father, called Rangi and Papa. And Rangi is the sky, and Papa is the earth, is the mother. And they are bound together in an embrace, and very, very, very tight embrace. And all their sons, everything that exists, is in between them, in the dark. And so everything started thinking about what the sons started thinking about what they can do to see light, because they were living in the dark and the cold, and they wanted to see light. Like I said, light is an element that is very reoccurring in mythological, cosmological myths. So they started talking about what they can do, and one of the sons, which is called Tumatawenga. Very difficult names for us, at least. Tumatawenga proposed that we the sons kill one of the elder parents. Of course, in this case, he proposed to kill the sky, so we can have the earth, we can build things, and we can see the light. But the other sons weren't of the same idea, and the other idea was to separate them. The idea of separating them came from Tane, which was the god that later became the god of forests. Now, every son of the two parents tried to separate them, and they tried and tried and tried, and they failed. And then Tane, instead of trying to separate them with its hands, got on his back and started trying to separating them with his legs. And he managed to separate the two parents. And for the first time, all the sons saw the light. Tane built this separation, and of course, the separation is made with his forests, with his big trees. And of course, this was beautiful, but not all the sons captured this with the same ideological beauty of light and sun. They started thinking that maybe it's not a good idea. For example, one of the most angry sons was Tauramatea, which thought that this was a terrible idea because he wanted darkness and cold. And Tauramatea was the god associated with storms and winds and clouds. And the myth goes on to explain how Tauramatea and the other gods entered a war between them. And a lot of them died, and the war started growing, and Tauramatea started building on his armies and had a lot of sons, and every son of the god of thunder and storms had a name. And every son is associated with some kind of cloud, with some kind of wind, and the direction of winds, and pattern of winds, and different kind of storms. And it really becomes interesting, because if you think about it, what this myth says is that, apart from the origin, but when you have the birth of the universe with the light and everything, in exchange you have anger. You can't have everything and beautiful and perfect. What this explains is the reason why the Maori had hurricanes and cyclones and storms and winds, and they use this myth to give an explanation about different kinds of winds and different patterns and different kinds of storms. And of course, it's naive if we think about it in a scientific way. But remember, They weren't stupid. It works. If you want to give an explanation of how things works, because you want your crops to grow. You don't want a storm to come and destroy everything. So you think about what you can do. You don't have scientific comprehension about reality, so you don't have that possibility. So what remains? Well, you know that in your social bonds, if you have a war with someone, well, the idea is that or you win or you make peace. So the relationship of humans with the storms and volcanoes and other myths is, in this case, related to trying to resist to the storms or trying to make peace. So trying to make offerings and to behave good and thinking about what is good and what is evil and how the gods want you to behave. And it's a way of trying to make sense of what you can do to stop your crops from being destroyed and your house and etc. Now, this myth is related to water. Water is extremely important like light. And we see water everywhere in other myths in other parts of the world. For example, if you read the Bible, you will see that in the beginning, there was nothingness and informal matter. So it didn't have an order. And in every myth, we see this as a start. It's nothing, then it's order, and then we have conflict. And if you look in the Bible, there is the same myth. It's beautiful because for example, in Genesis, you have two versions of how the world was created. You have a version in which you have the birth of the stars, the planets, and then you have the birth of vegetation, animals, etc., the creation. On the other page, in just turning the page around, you have the chapters in which you have another explanation of a different story about the genesis of the world. So in the second part, the Genesis was in a garden of Eden, and God creates everything for man in this garden. And it's interesting because the two myths are from two different traditions. It's not a case that there are two myths. The Bible was composed in centuries and centuries, and these myths were fused together very in a century between the 3rd and the 2nd century before Common Era. So prior to that, the myths weren't fused together like that. But the interesting thing is that you go along and you see that there's a conflict. The world is going to be destroyed, and only a few of the humans managed to survive. This idea of a conflict is part of a lot of other myths. For example, in the Bible, you can find the myth of the flood. The flood is a myth that is borrowed through the Babylonian mythical origin. If you read the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, for example, you will find floods. The idea behind much of the Old Testament's narrative of Noah's flood comes from the narratives that Jews borrowed in the ancient tradition from Babylonians, because they were captive in Babylonia. So when we talk about cosmogonies, the idea of how the universe began, we have to remember that every myth is in relationship to other myths, because we create them, and we create them in the image of what we want to say. So, of course, in the Bible, we found that everything is created by something that is above nature. If we look at the Babylonian tradition, everything is created through nature. So nature is kind of God. But if we look at the Jewish tradition in the Bible, God is something else. It's more similar to ancient Egypt tradition. For example, think about ancient Egypt. Okay, we have a lot of gods. How did the universe begin for ancient Egypt? In ancient Egypt, we don't have one narrative. We have at least 4 big narratives. in 4 big urban centers. And it's Hermopolis, Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes. And every tradition is accompanied by what history made out of that city. So, for example, the most successful mythological tradition was that of Thebes, but it wasn't sudden. Prior to that, Hermopolis had a bigger success. And when the city of Hermopolis started decaying, the city of Thebes was starting to get richer and richer. And of course, more merchants passed there. And of course, that passed different traditions about history, about mythology, about how the world was created, and gods, etc. For example, in every tradition, we have this idea that the world was made out of water. And of course, it makes sense because everything you do in the ancient Egypt is related to what the Nile does. So the mythological beginning of the universe is related to water. In this case, there were primeval waters, and 8 gods came out of this water. From the primeval waters, there were 4 feminine gods and 4 male gods. The 4 male gods were Hu, Nu, Kuk, and Amun. And the feminine were Huamet, Nuanet, Quaket, and Amuanet. Now, these 2 versions of gods were important because we started building on these myths to build a bigger relationship between everything we see in nature. Males were frogs and females were snakes. These 2 creatures were creatures that lived in and out of the waters, and are very symbolic of our relationship with crops too. And crops are very important. If you look at the ancient Egypt myths, you see that you have a gradual passing from the myths related to finding things to myths related to agriculture. So we have the age before agriculture and the age after agriculture. In the Sumerian myths, we see the same thing. There are narratives and gods that give people skills to build cities, skills to have agriculture. It's not a case that Eden is a garden. The idea of a garden, of a place in which you have to build things, which is isolated from everything else, is related to the idea of isolating a patch of land and building on it, and building crops and building cities, etc., etc. And the birth of the myths about how the universe began with us transitioning from the phase in which we gathered things around us, we hunted and gathering, to the phase in which we started building crops and agriculture. So it's important because we see how this changes our idea of the universe. And it's important because in every myth that we see of how reality is made, for example, in Greece, we see differences on how we interpreted reality. Now, Greece was very related to cities. And of course, the myths of ancient Greece are different because they are related to conflict, because cities in Greece were in eternal war between them. And when we start to look at how conflicts build between different cities in Greece, you start to see how different cities have created different mythologies with different gods that make them win. Now, I'm going to talk about how the ancient Greek mythology began, how the universe began in ancient Greek mythology. So the first thing, let me see so I don't get confused. So everything starts from chaos. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of questions of people who are asking me why I'm doing this in English, because there are a lot of people that follow me here in Italy. So I'm going to explain. For those who arrived now, I'm doing a video for the Global Astronomy Month for Astronomers Without Borders. in Italian. Ciao ragazzi, sto facendo un video per il mese internazionale dedicato all'astronomia, in particolare per Astronomy senza frontiere. Quindi sto facendo un video in inglese perché è dedicato per un pubblico internazionale. Grazie, benvenuti a tutti. Sto parlando di cosmogonie, di miti su come il mondo è iniziato. I'm talking about myths on how the world began, how ancient people imagined the birth of the universe and how things changed in our history. Now, I was talking about ancient Greece and the idea of the birth of the universe from chaos. So we're seeing that chaos is the leading theme in a lot of different cultures, but in Greece, chaos is very, very dominant. Chaos gave birth to some of the main characters of ancient Greece mythology, like the Abyss, or Gaia, which is Earth, and Eros, which is love, and Erebus. And the thing is, if you consider these primordial beings, we see that these are the things that are most important for ancient Greece. So we have, for example, love, but we have the world. And we have, of course, because of Gaia, we have Uranus. Uranus was the first son of all these things, because Uranus was born from Gaia, and Gaia was virgin, and Uranus was the sky, the god of the skies. And Uranus reigned over Gaia, and this gave birth to everything else. And again, it makes sense. Prior to this, there was only chaos, and we have then the earth, the sky, rain, life. So we can see a pattern. It's the same thing as in other cultures. Remember when we were talking about the Maori culture and the Maori mythology? Now, after Gaia gave birth to Uranus, which is the sky, together they gave birth to the Titans. The Titans were Hyperion, Iapetus, Corios, Cryos, Kronos, and the other half were females. So we have Phoebe, Rhea, Theia, Themis, Thetis, and Mnemosyne. So we have all these Titans, and then we have the Cyclops. Now, there were a lot of Titans, there were a lot of suns, and everyone was going well, everyone was happy, till one day Uranus started being a little angry and a little ashamed of how ugly the Cyclops was. So he took some of the sons of Gaia and he closed them in the abyss. So now they were gone from the earth. And Gaia didn't quite like this, and that's the birth of the conflict. Now, the important thing in all this is that you have to remember that conflict generates life. Conflict generates new gods. In this case, conflict generates new order. For the ancient Greece, this is very important because we have the ancient Greek cities like Athens, Sparta, etc. But these ancient Greek cities came after some other prior civilizations. For example, Crete. And we have these other civilizations living in Greece, which were part of an ancient civilization that collapsed. After the collapse of the civilization which lived before the Greece, we have the birth of the ancient Greece cities. We have a different kind of order. And we see the same thing when we look at the mythology and how the universe was born and how everything else is born. Because when Uranus starts killing some of the sons of Gaia, Gaia asks Kronos to castrate and to kill Uranus. Kronos enters in a war. Kronos is one of the Titans and enters in a war with his father, with Uranus. After this, we have one of the sons of Kronos with the Titan Rhea. Kronos and Rhea have a son, which is Zeus. And Zeus is one of the main characters because he is the beginning of the new order. Now, Kronos feared that the other gods were going to do to him what he has done to Uranus. So Kronos fears that Zeus was going to kill him. Zeus, on the other hand, was tired of the reign of the Titans and wanted a new reign of the Olympus gods. Now, what he does is he liberates the Cyclops, he builds an army, and he goes after Kronos, and he kills him. And then Zeus is supreme god. But of course, we have the order of the ancient Greek cities and the new order, etc., etc. But we have a new conflict because the idea of the ancient Greeks was that the universe is always changing. So, of course, we have a beginning from chaos, but the order in which they lived was not the order in which everyone will live forever. Zeus feared that something like what he did to his father could happen to him. So he ate his first wife, Metis. His wife was pregnant of a goddess named Athens. And Athens, or Minerva, was born after Zeus ate her mother from Zeus's head. And it's important because it's symbolic of knowledge and what Athens is a symbol of. So we have this ever-changing mythology. This is in the south of Europe. Now, what happens if you go north? You do remember the Norse mythology, Vikings. What was their idea of the universe? Well, their idea of the universe is of chaos, of nothingness in water. So there were primeval waters, and then one day the sons of Bor lifted the world on their hands, and there was the world. And they started building on the world. They built it, everything, and mythological creatures were born out of them, and the Aesir were born, and then the dwarfs were born, etc., etc. But the important thing in the Norse mythology is Ragnarok, the end of everything, which will devour everything, every god, and then will turn to chaos. So we have the start, life, and ending. So it's important because not every culture has this pattern of chaos and return to chaos. And this is a different way of interpreting things. Of course, it's not isolated. We see these patterns all over the world. But the fascinating thing about astronomy is that every myth I talked about is written in the sky. So many of these traditions were oral. People had the need to give explanations of things, but they had to need to remember them. So on one side, they were oral traditions, but they were in poetry or in songs. For example, the works of Homer. On the other hand, they were written all over the place. So it's difficult to remember, for example, the myth of the birth of a mythological creature, but it's easier if you relate that to something around you. For example, to a place or something in the sky, for example, the aurora borealis, or for example, a volcano or an island, or how everything around you was built. And of course, this is related to what we said at the beginning, because the myths about the origin of the universe are born because we wanted to explain things, we wanted to understand. And this is written not only around us, but it's written in the sky, because we built an imagination, we built constellations. So we built the idea that the sky has an order, that those patches of light that we initially didn't know were stars, those patches of light weren't chaos. Of course, they seem ordered in a chaotic way, but we kind of like seeing patterns. This is because we have the idea that everything has to have an explanation. So when we looked at the stars, when we saw all these dots of light, we started building on narrations and on what is the meaning of their position and their order, and why are they changing over seasons. So we saw that the change of constellations in the sky was related to the change of seasons on Earth. And the change of seasons was related to how our crops work and how we managed to live on Earth. So it was easy to think that constellations have our fate in their hand, and that astrology has a sense. And for ages, we thought of astrology as a science, because we thought that if we manage to interpret how the heavens change, how constellation changes, how planets work, then we can understand how everything in the sky is related to us. This idea has never gone away. It's just changed, and now we think of it as astronomy. Now we think of everything in a scientific way. We still understand that we are related to everything. We still want to explore. We want to dive into the mystery of finding new things, but it's in a different way. We know that it's the gravity of Jupiter or a certain constellation has nothing to do about who we are and how we live, and if I'm angry or if I'm going to have a nice day or not. It has nothing to do with it. But we are made of the same atoms as everything else in the universe. We share a common history. Every atom in us and every atom in Jupiter or Mars once was a part of a star. If we trace the origin of every atom in the universe, everything we know of was once in the same common place prior to the Big Bang. And this leads us to our myth, our idea of cosmology, our contemporary idea of how the universe has begun. Now, you could say that as ancient people created myths about how the world worked with gods and conflicts, we create myths on how the world works using science. But who's to say that what we think about the world now works? Maybe in 1,000 years' time, someone will talk about our idea of the universe and say, well, they had a lot of myths, and they thought there was a Big Bang, and they thought of this, and they thought that. It is possible, but the beautiful thing is that, how we said at the start, we try to stick with the things that work. And when you don't have a scientific way of looking at things, when you don't have a scientific method, you try your best with the interpretations you have. And if you look at the myths of which we talked about, if you look at how we thought about the universe, it was an ever-changing thing. We weren't stuck on one idea. We weren't stuck on the idea that the world has begun like this and the gods want this. No, we were constantly creating new gods, new stories, new interpretations. If you look at the Greece interpretation of the world, at a certain point, we created the myth of Hercules, half god, half human, who comes on Earth and fights the gods on our half and helps us and gives us courage and gives us will to go and try to change our world, to not passively accept what happens to us. This idea was new. It was introduced in the world to explain what was changing in our relationship with the world. And we done this since the beginning. We always changed our idea of the world in a way which was compatible with what we saw worked. So if we saw that our interpretation of a conflict between a god of thunder and storms for the Maori helps us navigate, because if we saw that when this interpretation makes us think that, so if gods are angry between them, and if storms are angry with forests, then we need to stay very, very, very careful when we see a storm. Well, this works. Of course, then it stops working when you see you have new explanations, you want to navigate, you want to hunt, you want to do other things. well, in that case, your explanation of how the world works stops working, and you need a new thing to explain how the world works. So we are now using science, and it works really, 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 really good. And it's beautiful because our idea of how the universe began with a Big Bang is, of course, a myth. It's a creation with science, as ancient people created with myths, with their idea of the world. We are creating a narration, and we see it works. It manages to give us internet. We have satellites out there which work because we use the theory of relativity by Albert Einstein. If it wasn't for that theory, satellites in orbit couldn't communicate with us in the right way. We wouldn't have satellites, and we wouldn't have probably internet, for example, and cell phones, and a lot of things we see in our world and which work. One day, maybe we will find new proof. Maybe we will dive in the center of a black hole, and we will find that the singularities at the center of black holes give us a new interpretation of how the universe was born. And it's something that we never thought about. Maybe there are thousands of different dimensions. Maybe there are thousands of different universes out there. And maybe it's extremely different from what we now think of the universe. But it's not to say that what we think now is wrong. Until we find proof of something that makes us think that the universe may be different, we have to try in all ways possible to make things work with what we have, which is science. And science is working really fine for now hundreds and hundreds of years. So this was my talk about cosmogonies, about myths and astronomy. I hope you liked it. We are now nearing the end of of this talk, and I'm going to try to answer some of the questions. If you want to make a question, try making a question in English. I will try answering a couple of questions, and then we are off, and we are going to see each other and hear each other in a new life. Now, questions? Thank you for all your, because you followed me, and I'm seeing a lot of messages in Italian. I'm sorry I can't respond now to everyone. Now I'm just going to say this one thing in Italian. Se volete farmi delle domande, dato che sto facendo la live per il mese internazionale dell'astronomia, quindi sarà distribuito su piattaforme in cui verrà seguito da persone in tutto il mondo, se volete fare delle domande potete farle in inglese, cercherò di rispondere in inglese. Altrimenti comunque possiamo rivederci, e vi prometto che farò questa versione della live anche in italiano, e potremo discuterne meglio. Grazie a tutti, ragazzi. Mirantea, Adrian, do you think we are heading towards some revolutionary astronomical discoveries? Well, I think we have some big mysteries, and usually when we find things that we don't understand, it's because there's something fundamental with which doesn't quite turn right. So, for example, we have one of the biggest mysteries, which is dark energy. Dark energy is the reason why our universe is expanding in an accelerating way. And dark energy is related to space-time itself. And we aren't sure about why and how the universe is expanding. And we aren't sure about why it's expanding in an accelerating way. We know that maybe it's because of a constant called C which is the constant of space itself, energy, the kind of energy typical of space-time itself, but we really aren't sure. It's extremely difficult because we don't have any way now to verify what happens and at that level. So dark energy is maybe the biggest mystery in cosmology now. Of course, we can talk about what was before the Big Bang and inflation. Inflation is one of the biggest mysteries because we are pretty sure it's right, but we can't really grasp a definite proof that it happened. Inflation is the moment little before Big Bang. So Big Bang, the Big Bang is the expansion that we are used to in the universe. It's not the beginning of the universe. So the beginning of the universe, where we have an instability. Everything that we see was already there. Everything was existent. It's not something that was born out of nothing. It was an energetical potential. So we have everything, and in an incredibly small fraction of a second, everything becomes thousands and thousands and thousands of billions of times bigger. So that was the inflation. And after that, we have the expansion of the universe, which is at a rate very much below this. So we have an extremely rapid expansion, which we call inflation, and then we have this expansion, which is related to what we call the Big Bang. And we kind of think this is the way things went, but we don't have proof, because we are kind of making questions that are far, far beyond the reaches of our technology. It's kind of like when Newton thought about gravity, he thought his contemporaries thought about black holes. In the 1700s, it was 3 centuries ago. 3 centuries ago, people were thinking about black holes because it made sense. If gravity is a formula that works, and if you take gravity and you take an object and you calculate what the velocity of escaping that gravity could be, it makes sense thinking that an extremely massive object could be so powerful from the gravitational standpoint that nothing, not even light, can go out of there. So the Newton contemporaries thought of this as a black star. And they didn't know how to explain it, and they thought that it was kind of impossible. They thought about it, and they tried to explain how gravity could work if it was so big, and how could you produce an object so giant and so powerful. But then again, they thought, well, something like this is extremely improbable and maybe doesn't really exist. We needed to make 3 centuries of progress, technological and scientific progress, to manage to answer those questions. And it's possible that we are at the same point. Maybe we are making questions that will find an answer 3 centuries from now, in 2300. Andrea Bontempi. Adrian, is it true that it has been proven a non-gravitational interaction for the dark matter? Well, it's complicated. If you're referring to the recent AMS results from the International Space Station, maybe we have a link between dark matter and antimatter. Things like antimatter are produced in extremely energetical interactions in the universe, but we don't know how much, and we don't know what is dark matter. We kind of think that it's a particle because it makes sense and nothing else. We tried really manages to explain things like a particle, and we know that out there are particles that are very massive and that don't interact with anything. It's just that there are tens of particles that we haven't yet discovered, and we know they're out there. We know that our understanding of how many particles are out there is very incomplete. So it makes sense. It wouldn't be strange to find a particle that explains that matter. It's only that we can't do it with our current technology, and we're trying with our best telescopes, but we can't manage to capture these particles. But the idea behind this new study is to find out if we can see the interaction between these particles and antimatter in the universe. So it would be an indirect proof that something like this happens, and that something like a non-gravitational interaction could exist, because really dark matter tends not to interact with anything out there. But it is complicated, yes. Lion tutorial. I have a question. Why you connected mythology and astrology? They are totally different. I know it's a simple question, but I didn't follow the entire video. So the link I made between mythology and astrology is that they are both interpretations of what we see around us. So myths were born to give an explanation of our relationship with the world. Astrology was born to give an explanation about our destiny in the world. And it was related because we saw a relationship between how the stars moved and how seasons moved, and seasons influenced us. And we're very, very, very good as a species to see correlation, but not always correlations are related to causation. For example, you could see that in the term in which Obama was president, in Southeast Asia, lemons started being extremely rare. So there were fewer lemons in Southeast Asia when Obama was president. Are these two things related? No. But we kind of are complicated as a species, and our brain works in a way which makes things stuck together. So we tend to always find correlation and causation. So when you hear someone that says that you are very brave because the stars say so, and then you act brave, and your brain kind of makes sense of this and tries to create a narrative. Now, this was tied to the idea that things in the sky, like eclipses, were related to important events on Earth. So eclipses were noted during wars, during the death of kings, etc. So astrology kind of built on that, on the idea that we could think about who we are and how we progress just looking at the stars. So that's the reason I made the link between the two. They are different, of course. Telo410 asks, why are you talking in Italian? Now, I'm going to respond in Italian. Tela410, se sei arrivato tardi, non sto parlando in italiano perché questo video sta andando su una piattaforma dedicata al mese internazionale per l'astronomia, quindi è dedicata a un pubblico internazionale. È solo un evento speciale che è questa sera e quindi non ti preoccupare, farò questa live anche in versione italiana in futuro. Parlerò in italiano di queste cose un giorno, prometto. In questo caso il video è dedicato al mese internazionale dell'astronomia, agli Astronomi Senza Frontiere. Rose Creative asks, hi Adrian, do you think that there will be someone who created all things before all the physics laws, before the birth of the universe? Who created? I'm not asking about faith, but something objective. Now, the idea that there's a God that created everything is something that sticks around with us. So it isn't in conflict with our understanding of the universe. So you could think that God created the universe, and then the universe kind of went along by its laws, and it works by the scientific laws we know. God just was the first start. So this is an Aristotelic approach to things, because Aristotle, way before the theology which we are used to, made the same reasoning. He thought that everything in the universe has a cause. And you have to have a first cause, something that caused everything else. And that first cause was called, it was a kind of God in his idea. That was the idea of God. Now, the idea in modern astronomy of a God is unnecessary. It's not that you can't think about a God if you like it, okay, but it doesn't add anything, and it's impossible to prove that it's right or wrong. So it's like saying that a teapot exists in the orbit around the sun. You can't prove that it doesn't, but it doesn't mean it makes sense to think that there's a teapot around the sun or a rabbit on the moon. It's the same thing. You can say that there was a God at the start of everything. It's okay. It's from an astronomical, from a cosmological standpoint, it's unnecessary. It doesn't add something. It can't be proven. It can't be explained. It can't be proven wrong. It can't be proven right. So it's just something else. It's not related. There's no reason to think that something like a God created everything, because of course you could ask, well, who created God? There should have been someone else who created God. But of course you could say God is out of reality and he didn't have anything that created him. And of course you could say the same thing about the start of the universe. So the universe just started without the need of someone, just like you would say about divinity. It's complicated, and it's a philosophical question that has people writing treatises over and over every year. So it's a debate that is going on for centuries now, and you could talk about it for years and years. The main thing I'm trying to pass here is that if you are an astronomer, you could very well think that everything started with God or not. It doesn't make any difference, because of course, until you think that Earth orbits the sun because God made it and placed it here, well, things start really getting complicated, because of course there are people who think that the Earth has only 6,000 years old, and they take these myths very literally, when we know that Earth has 4.6 billion years old, and we know how the solar system was born, how nebulae are born, galaxies are born, etc., etc. So it kind of depends on the level on which you are interacting between faith and ideas about our interpretation of the world and science. I'm not a normal person, says, I think that you are free to believe in God because it's something that could complete your soul. But in my opinion, everyone was created by the Big Bang. Now, as I was saying, you can think about this in any way, but the main thing is what you use and how it works. So what I want to say is, remember to test things. If you try to build a new thing to, I don't know, a new instrument, a new musical instrument, you first of all try to hear how it sounds, if it works right. And the same thing you have to do with your ideas of the world. If you have an idea about the world, test it, see how it works, try to make it better. And science is an instrument to make things work better, because it's just an instrument. It doesn't give you an explanation about the world. You have to give it an explanation about the world. Science doesn't tell you how the universe was born. You have to tell it how the universe is born. And science only gives you a way of finding out what works and what doesn't work. Just confronting, observing the universe and making experiments, etc., etc. Giacomo Maggioli, hi Adrian, what do you think about matter-antimatter asymmetry? How do we explain the fact that matter and antimatter did not annihilate when they were created? Well, we don't know exactly what happened. We tend to think now that it has to do with the imbalance between the way gravity acts on matter and antimatter. It's the reason why at CERN in Geneva we are trying to create antimatter to make it look at how it interacts with gravity. If you have some anti-atoms, then you can look at how gravity works and these atoms. And if we see that antimatter is different in some way, we could start to understand why our universe is made of matter and not antimatter. Maybe there was more matter, maybe there was less antimatter, or maybe there's something that was missing. But it's extremely out there. I'm gonna take 2 more questions, and I'll have to ask you to stick to the topic of this. I know you have a lot of questions, guys. You're wonderful. I really would want to answer every one of your questions, but given that the topic is myths and cosmogonies and mythology about astronomy, about the birth of the universe, I'm going to try to answer questions that are related, and then we will close. Now we can see. Okay, Massimo Bossi, what do you think about the theory that says that our 3D universe came from an explosion happened in 4D universe? It's also it's complicated, because in a 4D universe you couldn't have anything that we are familiar with in a 3D universe. Just to say one thing, in a 4D universe, a cloud of gas and dust couldn't collapse to a center to build a star. So in that version of the universe, it would be impossible. Now, you could think of a way in which a 4D universe could have a 3D version of itself, but it's so complicated that it's well beyond my comprehension of cosmology. So I don't know how to answer this question at a level of detail far beyond this. I know that it's not realistic because we have no proof that a 4th dimension really exists. But then again, string theory is all based on extra dimensions. There are 11 dimensions, and in that case, all dimensions are extremely smaller than a particle. So not exactly another universe. But as I was saying, I'm not an expert on that field of cosmology, so I can't explain exactly what happens. Bokoyo60 asks me, what do you think about the myth of the multiverse? Well, it would be beautiful one day to say that we thought that all the universe was our solar system. Then we realized that the universe was big as a galaxy. And then we realized that there were thousands and billions of galaxies out there. And then we realized that there were infinite universes out there in a gigantic infinite multiverse. Of course, it's something that makes sense in many of the new theories that are proposed to explain inflation. As I was saying prior to this, inflation is the idea that prior to the Big Bang as we know it, the universe expanded extremely fast. In a fraction of a second, it became billions and billions and billions of light years bigger than anything we know. And of course, in this moment, we have no way of proving that this is right. So it's really something that maybe 2 centuries from now, someone will answer, but hey, we can't have all the fun in the world, right? Let something be discovered by our ancestors, our sons and nephews, etc. Okay. I'm gonna end this here because I promised everyone on Astronomers Without Borders that the video was going to stick around 1 hour. Thank you very much for participating. I love you guys. You are wonderful. continue and don't stop being wonderful. Continuate ad essere meravigliosi come sempre, and we'll see each other very soon here on Link for Universe. Subscribe, and I'll make a version of this in the future in Italian, so I promise. Thank you as always. A hug. Bye-bye.